he loved all of his students. He taught me twice at the university and when I was a student at the Army War College. So this evening, Dr. Deutsch will speak on the intelligence aspects of the planning of the D-Day invasion. Hal.
Those who heard me in the fall, well, that's perhaps less than half, and certainly not more than half of the group here. And the reason I asked that question is because inevitable, the question of ultra, which I discussed at considerable length last fall, comes in at many points at the engagement with the intelligence before and during the invasion of the continent. And here and there, I may have to repeat something, and those who heard me before will please excuse it, because in order to make some points clear, I have to keep the relationship before you. Now, you're all aware, of course, that in 1974 came this sensational revelation with respect to the role of ultra in World War II, a revelation which in many respects was faulty. The man was too old. I have nothing against people of 83, being just that age myself. But on the other hand, sometimes our memories aren't what they used to be. And unfortunately, the British intelligence people, despite the fact that they let Colonel Winterbottom go ahead after much heart burning and searching, they let him go ahead and publish the book. They did not allow him to get at the documents, and had to be written entirely from memory. In any event, as you know, that made a world sensation, and in many respects opened the floodgates with respect to the revelation of intelligence matters in World War II. That if you now knew about the most sensational and biggest of all the intelligence operations of World War II, and we're learning more and more about it as the British intelligence people and the Americans and NSA were issuing more and more documents that had been declassified. Under those circumstances, naturally, some of the restraints of holding back material went by the wayside. That didn't mean that everything has been revealed. Let me call your attention to the fact that the British have published not published but not released any Secret Service documents. They had in the late 60s changed the 50-year rule to 30 years for the general release of government documents. That did not have anything to do with Secret Service documents. And the Americans also holding back a good deal. And may I say, incidentally, in Britain, that not only means the regular Secret Service documents, but documents in other agencies like the Foreign Office, which refer to one or another matter that has to do with Secret Service matters. It was brought home to me very unpleasantly in the year 1970 when I was in the British archives at Kew Gardens and was looking especially, I'm a specialist in the history of the military conspiracy against Hitler, looking especially at any data which would refer to members of the German conspiracy coming to London, and they're revealing one or another thing about events in Germany. And I was thrilled beyond measure when looking at the printed index for the year 1939, I saw a reference to a report on conversation with Dr. Girdler. Dr. Girdler was the man who was supposed to be the head of the German government if Hitler had been overthrown at any time, right down to July 20th, 1944. And I, of course, rushed up to the desk and I said, I'd like to have this particular folder, and it was given to me after a much longer wait than you usually have to wait in our Library of Congress or the National Archives. And I took it back to my desk and I turned to the page that was referenced in the printed index, and there was nothing but the statement to be released in 2015. Well, that doesn't do me much good. I'm always hoping that I'll have a grandchild. Up to now, I'm not very hopeful about that. My 16 grandchildren, there isn't one historian among them. But I'm hoping maybe one of my great-grandchildren, and now I have 9 of those, will become enough interested in history that they will in 2015 look it up and then by some Ouija board or other special means of communication, let me know up or down what the story actually is. Now, a feature too that plays a role is, of course, that much other material that we don't happen to know about has been kept back. And the most sensational of all publications we've had on World War II intelligence is, of course, the British history of intelligence in World War II, which now has 4 volumes and has a 5th one still held back. This is the most exciting of all. This is volume 5, which is going to be written by the world's greatest military historian, Sir Michael Howard of Oxford University. And that deals with deception, the most exciting aspect, of course, of all intelligence operations of World War II. And I'm especially sorry tonight because dealing with the greatest deception of all human history, which in my opinion is the way in which the Germans were deceived on our invasion plans, I naturally would like to have the most authentic story of all, as I'm sure Sir Michael will tell it. He told me then when I saw him in 1980 that he already had finished the volume completely, was being held back largely because of the Blunt affair. Now, just yesterday we got the news of the death of Kim Philby. Remember, Kim Philby was one of the 4 of the famous Cambridge group, of which Blunt was the most important and in some respects the recruiting agent for the rest. And Blunt, who had been actually knighted by the Queen and had been given the great post of consultant on matters of art history, Blunt turned out, of course, to be the greatest crook of all in many respects from our standpoint. Now, we will, I am sure, here within the next couple of weeks, as the postmortems on Philby occur, here and there somebody's going to spill the beans on some aspects of this, the famous 4 of Cambridge, of which we would like to know a great deal more. Now, when the British were expelled from the continent in June of 1940, they, of course, under the inspired leadership of Churchill, were planning to come back as early date as possible. And for the next 2 years, in their discussions as we know them now from the documents and from Churchill's and other writings, they discussed ways in which they could prepare that eventual comeback to the continent. In the first place, they were thinking in terms of doing what they could to blockade Germany and starve her out. That turned out to be a complete flop because Germany, though of course under many stringencies because of the naval blockade, was able to conquer most of Europe from the Volga westward, and what she didn't conquer, like Spain and Portugal and Sweden, were pretty much under German, and Switzerland, under German domination, economically speaking. It was a kind of a bribery that they exercised. If you Germans don't invade us, we'll give you access to these and those raw materials and even to our finished goods. If you invade us, you'll probably destroy more of the production facilities than at present are servicing youth. So Germany then did dominate, say, everything after the conquest of Western Soviet Union, everything up to about the Volga River for a time, and that was sufficiently significant economically that one just couldn't starve her out at that, in that phase of things. Secondly, of course, the British were going to throw everything into a tremendous air assault. As many of you know, 50% of all British resources that were employed in the war went into the air war against Germany. This was their great hope, and they expected that within the next couple of years they'd really make a dent. It was a complete flop. The funny part is that the men who ran it didn't realize it. They didn't want to face the fact that, for example, the average British bomb in 1940, 41 into 42 was falling about 5 miles from where it was supposed to land, and the actual targets were often spared while completely innocent ones, unimportant ones, were being hit. So the air assault really didn't count very much really until the Americans got into the picture with their daylight operation. And then the rhythm of day and night between the Americans and the British did, of course, do a great deal to wreck the German war effort. Then the third feature was they were going to stimulate, and they were going to organize, they were going to arm the resistance forces in Europe. And the resistance forces, of course, even at that early date, had a considerable significance. But in the years 1940 to 1942 or so, resistance in Europe was just about balanced out by collaboration. In some countries like France, there was a heck of a lot more collaboration in those years than there was resistance, even though resistance has been so much romanticized both during the war and after the war. Resistance made no difference at all from the standpoint of the basic trend of the war in those particular early years, no matter what great the importance was later. Now, let's briefly refer to the intercept war, which I discussed. That is the interception of enemy dispatches in one form or another and their deciphering. And I discussed that, of course, last October. I said already, I've dealt with it in the main. I pointed out, and this you must keep in mind, that it was by no means a one-sided business. There was no shutout for the Germans at all. The Germans, in fact, were way ahead. And one of my somewhat fanciful, but I think still basically accurate way of illustrating this is to look like a baseball score in the set of the innings of the years, 39, 40, 42, and so on. And if you do that, you find that the score was way on the German side for the first 2.5 years or so of the war. And then it began to change, largely because Outler really became a significant feature. And of course, from 1942 on, the situation changed. By 1945, it was shutout innings, a la Viola, which were being gained by the Allies. But if you look at the whole war picture, the score was about roughly on the basis of 2-1, with, of course, the two Allied scores, runs being scored very late in the business. Now, I won't go over the various great breakthroughs. I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them that are very important. Spring of 1940, the breaking of the keying of the German Enigma messages of the Air Force, which was a very sloppy operation and made it much easier for the British to decipher what was being sent, so that for the rest of the war they pretty well knew what the Air Force was saying within itself. And then you have, next you have in June of 1941, the very important breaking of the keyings of the major messages within the British Navy. In 42, as I discussed in an earlier this meeting, you had a terrible blackout in the months from February 42 to December. They were not able to read any of the messages that were being sent within the German Navy to the submarines. And during those months, we came rather close to losing the Battle of the Atlantic. But in December 1942, the situation is going to change. Now, the most important, perhaps of all, of the breakings of the secrets of the German Enigma cipher machine was that of German intelligence. The German intelligence had the general name Abwehr, A-B-W-E-H-R, which means, rather, it's counterintelligence, really, but included all the intelligence. And the German intelligence leaders in Berlin could, of course, not communicate with their agents in enemy countries, because you couldn't ship these Enigma machines into an area where they might be captured. So those communications had to be by little radio sets that the spies and other agents carried with them. But the communications within the Abwehr itself, between Berlin, for example, and Hamburg. Hamburg was the force station, the one that was in charge of all operations in Britain. And so from the headquarters in Berlin to Hamburg, and also There were big stations in Madrid and Lisbon. This the Allies could intercept. And in January of 1942, they broke the first of the secrets, or the keyings. The keyings, of course, were always changing, but once you had a good start in this, you usually could expect that within a couple of days, sometimes within a day or two, get the gist of a German Enigma message. And this then meant that the British could intercept everything that had to deal with intelligence operations in Britain, and it resulted in the unbelievable thing that every single German agent, every single one, I have seen that statement made in 1970 in the famous book of Sir John Masterman of Oxford University, who headed the committee, was in charge of this operation, which was called the Double X, or the DX, or a double cross, most often. And Sir John Masterman tells us a good deal about the story of what they were doing. And they were, I've seen a statement from in his book, as I say, published in 70 or 71, and I haven't seen a single claim to the contrary that there was a single German agent in Britain for the rest of the war who was not taken over by the British. Now, the British actually did three things with these agents, and I'll return to this more fully later. If they were hardened Nazis, loyal, in other words, to the Hitler regime, and wouldn't join and help the British, they were simply executed, as the laws of war, of course, allowed. If they said, we'll go with you, but they weren't quite trusted. They were kept in jail, but kept working, in a sense, under the direction of people who told them what messages to send to Berlin, and or the messages were sent in their names. And the third is the ones who perhaps had been working only for money and were perfectly willing now not only to save their lives, but also to be prosperous, carried on in Britain. And some of them became very prosperous because, well, I might as well say here, there were about 120 of these agents, and the great majority were in jail. And then there were, I suppose, something like 30 or so who were free, whom they trusted enough to allow to be free. And of these 30 or so, there were about 6 or 7 real stars. And of these 6 or 7, there were 3 superstars. I'm sure some of you have heard the name of one or the other: Garbo, Tate, and Tricycle, which are all cover names of the Tricycle for a man, Yugoslav named Popov, who were the stars of the operation, and who each of them was allowed to profit hugely by having not only a couple of the other fellows who were free working with them, but all kinds of imaginary people. They were hiring all kinds of Britishers, for example, to work with them, and of course had to pay them, which meant that Berlin was in some way transmitting funds to these people, and the British government was perfectly willing to have them keep that. So they became quite prosperous on that basis alone. Now, a very interesting question is, did the existence of Ultra and this child of Ultra, in a book on Ultra, which I hope to call an Ultra Primer, there will be a chapter which I expect to call Children of Ultra. By Children of Ultra, I mean things like the Double X system, which is very much the senior child, which were very effective operations because of Ultra. And certainly the Double X system, as well as the other parts of Ultra, were a very vital part of the story of the tremendous deception that we're considering tonight. Now, that, in my opinion, not only determined many aspects of the deception, but determined the basic character of the Allied operation. I had a very interesting argument with this at a conference in London in 1980, where on the other side were 2 men for whom I have enormous respect: Sir Michael Howard, whom I've mentioned before, and whom I've referred to as the world's greatest military historian, recognized everywhere pretty much as that. And then the other is Professor Ralph Bennett of Cambridge University, who has written now 2 books The second is not yet published. The first one is called Ultra in the West. It's the only treatment of ultra that we have for a major phase of the war. We have broad coverages of the war, and we have references to many phases in these books, but for an intensive study for a major phase of the war, that's the only one we have. And the second one is written by the same man, as I say, is not out yet, but should be out almost any day, Ralph Bennett again, and that deals with the war in the Mediterranean area and of course also in Africa. Now I say then with great humility that I dare to argue with these two men who just couldn't believe in my thesis that ultra and its children determined pretty much the way in which they chose Normandy. My logic is the following. Without ultra, I couldn't have even dreamed of carrying out the big deception of making the Germans believe that you were going to carry out an operation in a completely different area than the one that you did. And then once that you were there, that it was not diversionary, but was, that it was diversionary. Make the Allies, the Germans think it was diversionary, and the big thing was going to come somewhere else. Now you see, my argument is that this couldn't have been done in reverse. You couldn't have, there were two, let's look at the map for a second here. I know that it's pretty far from you, but in a general way the contours of Western Europe may be clear. Somewhere the Allies had to invade between Dunkirk, which is in Belgium over here, and let's say roughly Cherbourg on this peninsula here. Yet farther than that was too far away from Britain. The Germans, of course, knew perfectly well. They had an example now in Italy. When I talked about with the interrogated German generals in 1945, and one of the questions I and some of my colleagues loved to ask them, what do you think of the American military leadership? And they'd hem and haw, because after all, a prisoner knows that if he says something you don't like, life may be very unpleasant for them. But if you insisted, and if they finally got some confidence in what you were saying, that you wouldn't mind if they criticized, they said, we thought you Americans were going to be hell-bent for leather. You had the reputation of being very daring, of being in fact reckless. We thought you'd come over here and make all kinds of chances. What do we find? We find that every American general, with the exception of this guy Patton, every American general, like every British general, plays it safe. If there are two courses, one of them very risky but with enormous opportunities, and the other one infinitely less opportunity but not nearly as risky, they'll always do the latter. And that's what the Germans knew now from their experience in Italy, where they felt we should have attacked much farther north than the Salerno area, south of Naples. And we should have attacked either right west of Rome or even farther north than that. And where they found that we didn't take a chance because that was too hard to support with at least land-based air power. We could support it only with aircraft carriers. That, of course, is much more limited than if you have land bases. So they were quite sure, and they were 100% correct, that we would not invade in areas where we could not exercise a really good control of the air from Britain. And there were only two areas. The best, of course, by far, was right here, the Straits of Dover. On the French side is the famous city of Calais, and the term for that area is usually the Pas de Calais, the PAS, and then small de of Calais, which means, in other words, the area around Calais. And the other was Normandy, which also was not nearly as close, but fairly close. Now, naturally, the great temptation for the Allies would be to make it to Calais, because think how much closer they were to the heart of Germany from there than if they moved from Normandy. Another thing, if they landed in Normandy, they would have to come across the great barrier of the Seine River here, and that would present great problems of one type or another. So I don't think you ever could have made them believe that you were going to land in the Pas de Calais if you, or rather never believed that you were landing in Normandy when you really expected to land in the Pas de Calais. And the Germans, knowing that the temptation was to play it as safe as possible from the standpoint of air support, were from the beginning rather inclined, most of them, especially the high command in France under the well-known Field Marshal Rundstedt, to believe that Calais would be the area. And if it had not been for Ultra and its children, they never could have carried out anything remotely like the deception that I'm going to talk about. It would have been just too difficult. So this was not the kind of thing which could be discussed in high circles. You see, the trouble is that we have no evidence from high quarters, none whatsoever, about the importance of Ultra. In the first place, you of course have nothing in the minutes of the great American and British combined or single staffs, because there were so few people at the very top of these staffs who knew about Ultra that when you had the 10, 20, 30 people in the room who would take part in an important staff discussion, there probably would be about 2/3 of them who were not initiated. So Ultra couldn't be mentioned in the discussion. One could say, make a general remark like, our intelligence resources for this kind of an operation are much better than for that one. But you could not go into any kind of detail. So there's not a single minute of a single major headquarter, British or American, which mentions Ultra at all. Secondly, because of the need of secrecy, because everybody had taken an oath of secrecy, the generals and others who were initiated, because of course there had to be a certain number of people in the Ultra operation as such, at the various headquarters, these, when they wrote memoirs, couldn't mention Ultra. Now most of them were rather happy to do that, because you see, Ultra was an embarrassment to the victor generals, because then they couldn't say that's only because of my tremendous insight, my extraordinary talent, that I won this battle. The less was said about Ultra, the happier they felt. Now there's only one single book that's ever been written by any of these generals after 1974, and that's the second book of Bradley. Bradley unfortunately lived into the 1980s, but he was very decrepit in the last years, and Bradley, therefore, who had said nothing about Ultra, and therefore not explained many different things, then wrote that second book, of which in fact most of it was written by a ghost writer, a ghost historian in this case, and Bradley in fact saw only the first half before he died. The second half, which was of course based in large part on his conversations with this other man, is not something that he was able to correct in any kind of way. And I say Bradley is a wonderful illustration of what I'm talking about. Of all the battles of World War II, which are called Ultra victories, most of them of course are naval victories, or intelligence victories like Midway. Midway was not an Ultra or a magic victory because it was the decipherment of Japanese naval dispatches, not the machine ones that were sent, which gave you the background for Midway. But the situation here then was one where, just one second, I jumped right ahead here a great deal. In any event, you had here a situation where you did not find it possible to, well, rather, shall I say, Bradley, for example, found it, now I know I can't. The greatest land victory, I'd call it an ultra victory, is the Battle of Mortain, about which I'll refer briefly later. I wish I'd go into it more thoroughly. And the Battle of Mortain was, of course, Bradley's great victory. The great victory, almost the only really great Bradley victory as such. And Bradley kind of poo-poos Ultra. He argues about just when he got the information in connection with certain decisions and so on. So Ultra was something that the generals on the whole, I think, the American British generals are rather glad not to say anything about it, not to have even mentioned and brought up as a tremendous aid to assist them to avoid defeat and to win victory here and there. Now, a word or two about the role of the American leaders in connection with Ultra, the military leaders in this case. May I say I have an article which first appeared in the French periodical Revue d'Histoire de la Guerre Mondiale, the Deuxième Guerre Mondiale, the review of the history of World War II, which is called The Clans of Ultra, the American Generals. Deal just with the American leaders, both in the Pacific and the Atlantic. That has appeared just 2 months ago in an anthology that some may have seen, and that's published by the U.S. Army War College. And the clients of Ultra, in this particular case, of course, be they the Americans, and then also I have published, or it will be published nearly in July. In July, the British periodical, let's get back to where you can hear me better, Intelligence and National Security is going to publish, I think the whole section, volume deals with my own contribution, and it deals with the manuscript was about 115 pages, and I think there's 65 pages I've received just this last week in the page proof of this discussion, and that deals with the uses of intelligence by the principal commanders of World War II in Europe. That involves 4 Americans, 4 British, and 1 German, who of course is Rommel. And those who are really interested could let me know. I can get extra copies, but they're going to be rather expensive. I don't know how much. By expensive, I mean $3-4. And anybody who's really interested, let me know, and I think I can get copies for them. But I myself get only 25, and I have more than 25 historian friends who I think will be very interested in that particular topic. Now, the first of the Americans to be told about Ultra was Ike. Ike had come to Europe and was slated there to run the show in the northern area until Marshall would, as was assumed, would eventually take over. And shortly after Ike had arrived, this is July 1942, as I recall, Churchill invited him out to the state that is in the prerequisite of the British Prime Minister. And there, in a very mysterious and impressive way, he said, I want you to take an oath that after the thing I reveal to you now, you will never, under any circumstances, go into an area close to the front where an incursion of a German raiding party might grab you, that you will never, under any circumstances, fly in an airplane over enemy-controlled territory. And Ike took that oath, and then he was told by Churchill about Ultra. And that was also the situation for most American leaders. Few of them were as open to things as Ike. Ike, and the same I can say for MacArthur, and I'm glad to do the latter because I'm not a great champion of Confederates MacArthur. Neither of these shared the rather general detestation and dislike for intelligence that was the case with most American and British generals, and in fact with generals all over the world. Intelligence was associated with spying. Spying was a dirty business, and officers expected to be a gentleman, therefore she had nothing to do with spying. And that particular prejudice was not present in the case of Ike, though it was in some of the others, and most of them did not take it very open-mindedly. If it hadn't been for Ike so obviously going for it hook, line, and sinker, they would have been much slower to adopt a favorable attitude than they actually were. Then, of course, as victory after victory was to be ascribed, or escape after escape from a serious defeat had to be ascribed to the Ultra information they got, they had no choice but to be converted, and toward the end there were none of them who dared to utter serious doubts about the basic significance of Ultra, even though they might have many doubts about the way it could rely upon particular items. Now, in summer of 1943 came another very important development. Oh, may I say one very interesting thing. When Churchill told well, pardon me, this comes later, a couple of months later. Ike is told by Menzies. Menzies was the head of British Secret Service. And Menzies came to Ike and told him the story of the double-cross system. And then he said, incidentally, we have just let one of our principal agents, was this man named Tate, report to Germany that you've arrived in Britain. Now, Ike's arrival in Britain was a major secret. The British public was told nothing about it. And the British government was quite a while before the thing got around. And here the British immediately recruited the Germans. See, they were so eager to build up the credibility of these stars that I've mentioned that they did extraordinary things like that. After all, what did it matter if the Germans knew that Ike was there? It was a very important general who was going to be in charge of the American build-up for a future invasion of the continent. They knew, of course, somebody would be doing that kind of thing. And but it made a terrific impression in Germany. And, of course, so much more gave credence to the belief that people like Tate were doing a fantastic kind of job. Now, in the summer of 1943, the Americans, for the first time, were by agreement given access to ultra raw material. Down to that time, the British had been the sole consumers of ultra and the sole transmission line to the Americans of the upshot of what they got. In other words, they didn't pass on the messages, but they gave the Americans summaries of what they were getting. Well, now it was agreed the Americans were going to send a team to Bletchley Park, which was the place where the big ultra operation was taking place. And this was sent over under Telford Taylor. Some of you know him as the man who was the prosecutor at Nuremberg of the American trials, which came after the international trials. And unless he's died recently, he still is professor of law at Columbia University. And under Telford Taylor, they then built up a group, started out with 6 or 7, and gradually it became much more than that, working with the British on the raw material of the ultra operation. And then another very important thing, in the various American armies and army groups, it now became the rule that they would be serviced by American officers. On at that time, everyone, for example, in Sicily, every man who commanded an army, in fact we only had one army there under Patton, every such person had attached to him a British officer known as an SLU, a special liaison or secret liaison officer, unit. And these people were, of course, selected for talent, but not really super selected. Some of them were not particularly fond of Americans, and showed that even toward an American general. And Patton, for once, for example, in Sicily, was so thoroughly disgusted with his British SLU, he'd had nothing to do with him, and took a whole new process of reconversion. May I say immediately that in the study that I've written, that I mentioned of the 9 generals, there are 2 that stand out. The one was the German Rommel, and the other one is the American Patton. I'm not a great lover of Patton, a man who makes him mistress of his niece in defiance of his wife's feelings, is not, in my mind, a person whom I greatly respect. On the other hand, Patton was, in my opinion, by far the most effective user of intelligence, by far, in the European theater of operations. And the American generals now, who commanded either armies or army groups, was never went below that. Neither the British or American army did corps commanders, which after all means the command of 30,000 men or so, were they ever initiated an ultra. The only ones you had to actually command an army, which usually meant a force of anywhere from a couple of 100,000 to 500,000, and or an army group, which could go well beyond that before you got this kind of information. And the Americans now got Americans as their SSOs, special service officers. And may I say, these people were super selected. I had acquaintance with 3 or 4 of them, especially one of them is the best friend I have in this world, who never told me, though I became his intimate friend in the late 50s, he never could tell me about the fact that he was the General Patch's SLU or SSO at the 7th United States 7th Army. And these people were all of them men in their late 20s or early 30s. Their ranks were, I think, nothing ever higher than major. But not a single one of them was a professional soldier, which somewhat chagrined my Army friends at Carlisle. They were all lawyers or professors or had some civilian occupation which had great broadening effect. And as I say, they were super selected, every one of them that I have ever heard of, as well as the ones that I happen to know or met briefly. It was an outstanding kind of individual, and they did a magnificent job. Now, let me talk about German intelligence. What were the Germans doing all through this period? Well, the Germans in the first place were losing the intelligence game all along the line pretty much, but it became infinitely worse in that particular period. Now the first feature here of great importance was that the Germans had to rely almost entirely on other sources than air reconnaissance. Air reconnaissance, which was so vital in this picture, became almost a complete zero for the Germans because of the enormous Allied air superiority over the whole Channel area. And for a German reconnaissance plane to cross the Channel in that period was no more than to take its life in its hands. And so they had to rely on other means in large part. Now, I mentioned before that the German intercept game was pretty good and had been way superior to ours in the earlier years of the war. But the bad feature here for the Germans was that with the enormous accumulation of forces in Britain and of military headquarters of all kinds and of all levels, that you had a mass of communication which was simply more than they could handle. They got, every day they got 3-4 times as many messages. I don't know how many per day. I've seen a figure once, I believe. But let's say that there were 3,000 messages a day. Maybe there were 10,000 sent by military headquarters in Britain. Well, you can keep up with that. There are all kinds of different codes and ciphers and so on. So they had to fall back on agents. And you've been told the story of the agents, that every single agent they had in Britain was in the hands of British intelligence. And that meant that German intelligence was being led astray right and left. The second feature, which is far more difficult to measure, is the fact that the German intelligence operation at the very top of the Abwehr had, even before the war, been penetrated by the conspirators against Hitler. The man in charge of it all, Admiral Canaris, was not so much an active conspirator, because he was a mystique character, didn't want to take a direct hand, but an encourager, a recruiter. Actually, all the people he recruited for the very top leadership were men known to him to be hostile to the regime. He was, how good he was as an intelligence man is very hard to say. I'll deal a moment with him here. Well, let's take it up right away. And both in his case and the other cases, you've had the question ever since, to what degree were they deliberately giving the German authorities, especially Hitler, false information in order to avoid a German victory, or to, in some cases, where they were ready to go all the way to actually bring on a German defeat. In the books written about intelligence, you will find still claims that Canaris was giving information to the Menzies, who I mentioned before was the head of the British Secret Service. They knew each other from, well before the war, no doubt about that. And there's one story that you will read that there actually was a secret meeting between Canaris, Menzies, and General Donovan, the head of my own outfit, OSS, in Spain, in Madrid, or somewhere else in 1944, in which they made various kinds of agreement. Now, I personally do not believe that Canaris himself deliberately gave information to the Allies which was going to cause a series of German defeats. On the other hand, he knew perfectly well that some of his people below him were doing that. Canaris himself was a great patriot, as I think the others in fact were. But they saw things somewhat different. The man who was his principal aide, General Oster, has been the center of what we call the Oster problem. The Oster problem is how far is a conspirator willing to go in order to bring about his country's defeat, or prevent at least his country's victory. And Oster's ready to go all the way. And when some of his friends in the conspiracy protested, he would say, yes, the information I now have given may mean so many German lives in this next operation. But it'll save millions of German lives if we can bring the war to an end quickly. So that even from the pure question of blood that we're shedding, we're infinitely better off if we prevent a victory, and in a sense, of course, that meant an Allied defeat. Now, so the matter of problem is to what degree that the people in the Abwehr at the top, of the top 10 men in the Abwehr, at least 5 were members of the actual conspiracy. And Canaris himself has to be brought in that picture too. Incidentally, I've worked on him for many, many years, and I've been for the last year and a half the consultant of the BBC in Britain on a television program which they are going to put out, in which he will be the central figure in many ways. And then next month we're going to have at the University Library a special session with Italian national television in which I will be interviewed on questions of Canaris in particular and his group. So this is something of tremendous personal and general interest nowadays with the whole world, in a sense, at least the more sophisticated parts, looking for things like these television programs which deal with those problems. And then another feature was the principal military intelligence of the German army, the branch for the West. The German intelligence of the army was divided into, the term was Fremde Heer, enemy forces, or foreign forces, West, and foreign forces, East. And the head of foreign forces West was Baron von Rehne, who was a member of the conspiracy. Now, he is regarded by many as having been a near genius in matters of intelligence. But there are many also who believe that von Rehne deliberately falsified intelligence in order to make things more difficult for Hitler's conduct of the war. So there were this whole string of ways in which the German intelligence was suffering far more in that phase of the war than it had before, and it made the victory of the Allied intelligence infinitely more one-sided than would otherwise have been the case. Now the Germans, of course, knew, as I said, that somewhere between Dunkirk and the Cherbourg Peninsula, there would have to be an Allied invasion, and the big question, would it be east or west of the Seine, the Seine River? Now, of course, they had to play it safe. They couldn't afford to guess and guess wrong. They had to make their best guess, but only up to the point where they would put much more important forces in the area which, according to what they thought the best guess, would indicate the probable or the almost certain Allied invasion. And here the operation, which the general term for all this is Fortitude, is a name for the intelligence operation to deceive the Germans, has scored an enormous particular success. Because it meant in the first place that the army in Normandy, the 15th Army, was very much starved in many respects. It was starved for the quality of troops. For example, almost all the Soviets in France. Many of you do know that Hitler was able at one time or another to make use of over 900,000, almost 1 million Soviet soldiers in German uniforms. And these, of course, were not employed against the Soviets. They didn't trust them that much. They were employed in the West. And that army had 23 battalions, roughly around 25 to 30,000 men of former Soviet soldiers, who, of course, were in many respects had to do with hand-me-downs. They had 92 different types of artillery pieces, for example. The stuff the Germans had captured from the Czechs and from the Russians and heaven knows who all in the war. And they had, as I remember, I have the figure here somewhere, there's 252 types of ammunition for the shells then, for the guns which were available. And they, of course, were anything but enthusiastic. Very many of these Soviet soldiers had enlisted with the Germans only as prisoners because that was the only way they could get a square meal and wear decent clothes and be treated something like a human being. So rather than sit in the camps and probably starve to death or be worked to death somewhere, they were willing to enlist. So of these 900,000 plus who served with the Germans, nobody can guess in what proportion, but just lay wildly, 400,000 did so because they hated the Stalin regime, and 500,000 plus because they just wanted to live more comfortably and more safely than was the case when they were merely prisoners. This was the army, too, which got all the misfit German outfits. Now, the Germans got tougher and tougher as the war proceeded with respect to accepting disabilities of any kind. When I was in France, which I was from September 1944 till I went to Germany in the occupation in May of 1945, I didn't have time to go out and interrogate German prisoners in the various camps near Paris. Some of my people, however, did so continually and, of course, tried to make that information of use to us. But one day, one of my boys who was going out said, "Harold, you don't seem to have much to do this morning. Come with me today, have some fun." So as I have a perfect command of German, I thought this would be interesting. And I went with him. I went into the camp with a couple of guards. And I said, take these three men right over here, and I'll talk to them. I hadn't picked them out for any one reason or another. And I certainly had not expected that they would have among them the kind of man whom I talked to first. This was a man in his 40s. He had lost an eye. He had lost 2 fingers of his left hand. He'd been wounded on the Russian front a couple of years before and had been invalided out. And then in 1944, they drafted him again, just as a regular soldier. And I think many of you know that they had stomach battalions because they couldn't just draft anybody who had been suffering from a stomach ulcer and stick him into a unit which was ordinary feed would very quickly wreck him. They had to give him a special diet. That would be very complicated unless you put all these people into one unit. So you had a stomach battalion, all of whom had the same kind of food. Then you had deaf soldiers. You couldn't have blind, but that was the next thing perhaps. You had deaf soldiers who couldn't hear at all or couldn't hear very well. I've heard that it was very dangerous to approach a deaf sentry and suddenly start him. In any event, these were all in 15th Army, and not in the 7th, in 7th Army, not 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais. The allocation of armored forces. There were 9 German armored divisions in France. Of these 9, 5 were in the Pas-de-Calais. 3 of them were down with Army Group G, which defended the Mediterranean coast, and only 1. And that was, was with the 7th Army, Normandy, and that was called the Panzer Lehr, which Lehr means instruction, as these were soldiers who were just being trained in armored warfare. They were good military potential, but they were not yet good armored men. And the very big best ones were not in the south, but were up in Pas-de-Calais, especially the 116th, which is supposed to be one of the finest armored regiments that still remained in the German forces. And so it went. Rommel, may I say, sensed better than any other German general that the Allies might do the unexpected. He was a fanatic on that point. I'm a good friend of German General Schmickle, who was the deputy commander in NATO a couple of years ago, the first German deputy commander. Remember, we first had an American commander and a British deputy commander. And then about 1976 or 7, they felt the Germans were just too important. Many employed more Germans than British in the Allied naval forces. And so they said, we better take a German to be on the same level as the British. And this is General Schmickle. Now, General Schmickle, I know him very well since 1957 and 8. He was a student of Rommel's in the military academy at Dresden. And he told me, you know, every single day, every single subject said, gentlemen, never play by the book. Always do the unexpected. Obviously not something completely insane. Do what the enemy regards as impossible, if it is at all in your mind conceivable. And Rommel turned us around. And he was inclined to think the Allies would do the unexpected. Now, he was of two minds. I mean, the evidence the Germans got was all for Pas-de-Calais. But so that at times he leaned in that direction, but more than any other, he also leaned toward the Normandy idea. And he wanted to play it much safer than they did. He begged for a whole flak corps. German term FLAK means an anti-aircraft corps, which is a very large organization indeed. He begged for 3 divisions of armored divisions rather than the one that they had. And he wanted as I recall, also 5 extra infantry divisions, and of course got no place. Incidentally, Hitler was, without any question, a man of some extraordinary intelligence, but a man who had never worked hard in any area, who had an incredible high opinion of himself, and was a wishful thinker in very many ways. But what he called his intuition, which of course is native intelligence, often was quite remarkable. Hitler's first feeling was Normandy, but then he was persuaded completely and stayed persuaded pretty much, except for 1 or 2 lapses, one of which I mentioned, that it was the Pas-de-Calais. So Rommel was turned down flat on these pleas. Now, there's one more feature I should mention about German intelligence, which explains its weakness in this period. And what that was that right in the middle of these events, not of the landing, but of the great breakout in Normandy, comes the 20th of July, when they try to kill Hitler and nearly succeed in doing it. And Hitler, of course, learned a great deal about the conspiracy thereafter. And just in those following weeks, the Allied information via Ultra was especially rich and good. It explains in particular, as I said, the victory at Mortain. And Hitler again and again in those weeks said, the Allies do know what we're going to do. How can they again and again sense what we're going to do? And then you would say, oh yes, of course, those traitors of the 20th of July, they gave the information. Now, I've said before, that's possible. Nobody knows just how much information they did give the Allies, especially Canaris. Well, Canaris was rather out of things by that time. He'd been very much demoted in January of 1944. But without any doubt, this served as a kind of a cover for the Allied deception operation. That Hitler, rather than insisting that there be investigation of every possibility by which the Allies had gotten this and that information, was ready to console himself again and again by saying, oh well, it's those traitors that gave the information to the Allies. And that meant that the German effort to try to find out what was going wrong with the information the Allies were getting, that this effort never really turned out to be very much. Now, I think we've covered most of these points that have to do with the weaknesses of German intelligence, and I already have mentioned the situation with respect to the lineup in Britain, that the Allies, remember, 3 groups: those who were executed, those who were in prison, those who were free and working fully with the British, and then of these, this small group of stars and superstars who did a really amazing job on their own, quite aside from the good information they got. I wish I had more time to discuss the physical aspects of the deceptions, which were extremely important. Now, the first of these physical aspects was to make the Germans believe that there was really a tremendous buildup in southeastern England of forces that went beyond anything like what they actually were, to make them believe that you had to have a lot of wire traffic in that area. The Anglo-Americans established 22 supposed military stations who carried on a lively correspondence among themselves day after day all through this period. This is down in Kent, in particular the area of southeastern Britain, where there were no Allied troops to speak of at all. Another thing they did to make the Germans think of a tremendous concentration there, which would jump right across the channel into the Pas-de-Calais area, was to build up fake fleets of landing ships. The Germans were terribly badly deceived on landing ships. The Allies did all kinds of things, especially the reports of these agents. And incidentally, a very important feature was that the Germans, like every military intelligence agency and better political intelligence agency, did not have one single organization. It's a well-known fact that you try to work through a whole series of teams as much as possible. You don't want them to even know each other. Therefore, when through a team, shall we say, led by Tate, who supposedly had never heard of Garbo, reported something that fitted in right with what Garbo had been reporting and his people, it seemed to be an ultra, really, I meant to use ultra a different term, an ultra proof that the information in this question was correct. And the result is that the Germans overestimate the Allied landing craft capacity by 4 to 1. The Germans assumed that the Allies would be able to land, according to the landing craft, they were supposed to have 20 divisions on the first day. The absolute limit was 5. Wasn't a chance beyond that. But in the ports just around the corner, going up the British coast there, you had vast fleets of fake landing ships. Remember, first of all, that only rarely did a German reconnaissance airplane get through. And when it got through, it had to fly very high and rush out as quick as they came in. And you couldn't make a really careful investigation and take good pictures. The result is that the British and the Americans got away with murder in having these fake ships, which were small ships of various kinds, which were then fitted with false decks and whatever else is necessary to make them look like landing ships. And there occurred one great disaster. Was an enormous storm, and these flimsy craft were wrecked right and left. And they had a terrible time. As I recall, for 3 days, they worked 24 hours a day. And as I recall, there's 5,000 men working on to put them back in some kind of shape. And where they again could be deceptive to the Germans in that respect. Now, of course, the biggest deception of all was with respect to the Allied numbers. For various reasons I won't go into, the Americans had decided not to have anything like the 190 plus divisions that they originally had planned. And what they had available for Britain was just about enough to, as I recall, 49 Allied divisions. But if the Germans knew that the Allied had 49 divisions, and once you had made your landing, remember the vital thing was, first of all, you deceive the enemy as to where you land. And secondly, when you do land, you keep on deceiving him because he thinks this, you must make him think this is diversionary. This is to fool the enemy as to what your actual build-up there. And the best way to do that is to make him think you have enough soldiers for a completely different invasion. So the Germans were made to feel from all these reports from double cross that the Allies had 79 divisions. And for example, there were shoulder patches for divisions which didn't exist. And the Allies, they found out that they really had gotten away with it when they captured in Italy a German book shoulder patches of Allied divisions. And here were all these fake divisions that didn't exist at all, but of which they had a certain number of shoulder patches described in the reports of the double-cross people, which the Germans had fully accepted. So the Germans think that there are roughly twice as many, 79 rather than 49, Allied divisions available, and especially through the fact that the invasion in the southeast was to be commanded by General Patton, the one leader for whom they had great respect, and who seemed to be the fighting general, as he in fact was among the Allied military leaders who were eventually to go to France. And part of the Fortitude plan was to have Patton figure as the head of an army group that didn't exist. First Army Group, FUSAG, F-U-S-A-G. And in fact, I remember being stationed in London in those months from February to September of 1944, that everybody was talking about FUSAG and thought it existed. They weren't in the inner group that knew it, that was a complete fake. And then when Patton went to France and commanded the Third Army, and that of course was the Fourth Army Group now of General Bradley, they had to find an excuse or a way to continue to deceive the Germans. So they brought over one of the top American generals, the man who had been in charge of the whole training program, General Leslie J. McNair. And General McNair then was now appointed officially as the commander of FUSAG. And unfortunately, McNair went to France, and there one of our biggest snafus of the period was when American planes in particular, not British planes, were supporting the famous Cobra operation, the breakout effort and successful eventually, of Bradley, got so mixed up that they killed, they killed and wounded over 1,000 American troops and also killed General McNair. And you couldn't hide the fact that McNair was gone, so they brought over another general whose name was well known, General DeWitt, and he was then officially declared the commander of FUSAG. You see, the wheels within wheels of this deception, which really surpass almost the imagination. Now, I won't say more than just a word about Fortitude North, because of course, the more they could make the Germans think that these vast numbers of Allied troops in Britain, supposed numbers, the more that they actually might have a separate operation in Norway. Now, Hitler had all through the period of the Allied buildup been terribly worried about Norway. He was, of all the German leaders, the most jittery about an Allied invasion of Norway, which never really, though Churchill liked the idea, was considered too seriously by the Allied military. They always poo-pooed it whenever Churchill brought it up again. And so they had a completely fake setup in Scotland, just like the fake setup in southeastern England, in the Kent area in particular, with fake arm patches and all the rest. And it worked sufficiently, even though there's some argument now as to how thoroughly it worked, especially with some of the German military leaders, but it worked with Hitler enough that when the year of 1945 begins, the last couple of months, January of 45, there were still 17 German divisions in Scandinavia. It's in Denmark and in Norway. About 250,000 men. By no stretch of the imagination did they need more than 100,000 to handle the local situation, any possible revolt on the part of the Norwegians, for example. And so 150,000 men were squandered, even that late, and many more, because some divisions were moved. As I recall, there were 4 divisions which Hitler reluctantly did take out when things got desperate in France. But the great majority, the 17 divisions that remained, represented a force infinitely beyond what he would have needed for local purposes. In other words, he needed them only in the event of an actual Allied invasion of Norway. And I say that's all I'll say about Fortitude North. I think it was basically effective, even though there are some arguments still about it. Now, on the invasion day itself, some interesting things happened. The Germans had scored some of their own successes. The Germans were not complete fools in matters of intelligence, and they scored one great success, and was called Operation North Pole or North Pole. And that was in the Netherlands, and it was a penetration of the Dutch resistance in particular, which was so complete that they were actually able to get the British to drop things that they needed themselves. The Germans said, we need uniforms of such and such, or needs cloth, something else, probably not cloth, but certain weapons. They would have the fake resistance report go to Britain, and the British would drop it down and drop it from the airplanes. So this was almost a ludicrous fooling of the Allies with respect to the Operation North Pole. Now, the British then, or pardon, the Germans knew exactly what the signals were going to be for the coming of the invasion. When the BBC would broadcast the first line of Verlaine's poem, Chanson d'automne, the Song of Autumn, whenever this first line meant the invasion would come the month in which this happened. That was actually broadcast on the 1st of June. Then when they would broadcast the rest of that first stanza of the poem, at that point it was announced that the invasion was coming within 48 hours. And this was picked up by the German wireless of the secret police, the SD, in Avenue Foch in Paris. You know, your Champs-Élysées and Arc de Triomphe area in Paris, right off leading from that is Avenue Foch, and there was this wireless outfit that got this message and immediately transferred it, of course, to OB West. Now, OB West is for German Oberkommando, or Chief Command in the West. That meant General Rundstedt. And so Rundstedt got that information. It was broadcast on the 5th. He got the information very late that night, and immediate alert was sent out. But who was alerted? The 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais, not the 7th Army in Normandy. So this then was of very little use to the Germans, having that information 48 hours roughly before the Allied, actually because it got it late in the evening, would be about 36 hours before the Allies would strike. Incidentally, on D-Day itself, Ultra was almost completely silent because the Germans were suffering from a serious wrecking of their communications areas, of communications facilities in France. The resistance and the Allied air forces together had as one of their major targets communication facilities. And they were able to do so thorough a job that the German leadership in France and between France and Germany had to rely in largest part on the telephones. And of course the telephones were affected too, but not quite as much. And on that first day, Ultra was virtually silent. But in the following days, the following 2 weeks, it was one of the richest periods of the entire war for Ultra. Now, despite the fact that we had the great advantage of having succeeded in the first place with respect to the place we landed, and secondly, in making Hitler himself, though fewer and fewer of the leaders, many of whom began to protest, that there was another landing coming in the Pas-de-Calais area. In spite of that, the situation was one of cliffhanging for days. The immediate crisis was when they found that Rommel was finally getting through to Hitler. Rommel, as soon as the invasion began, remember, Rommel commanded both these armies. He was commander of Army Group B. Army Group B was commanded the 7th Army and the 15th Army. And he now begged Hitler to send very considerable forces from the 15th Army to the 7th Army. And Hitler reluctantly on the 7th agreed. And with the invasions on the 6th, the next day, Hitler yields to Rommel and agrees that 3 infantry armored divisions, including the wonderful 116th, which was also in a good position farther down the Seine, up the Seine, where it could cross much more easily, and 5 infantry divisions would be moved to Normandy. And when the Allies got that, they of course had broken the secrets of the so-called Geheimschreiber, the secret writer. Now that was not an Enigma machine, that was something infinitely greater. It was so ponderous and so elaborate that you couldn't have one like the Enigmas with every unit of importance. The Germans produced 100,000 Enigmas during the war. The Geheimschreibers were big ponderous things that you could have only in major headquarters. And after a great deal of trouble, because the Geheimschreiber had 10 rotors in it instead of the 3 of the ordinary Enigma and the 4 of the Navy Enigma, the Allies had broken that secret, and they intercepted the message now, and Hitler says, yes, I agree, such divisions will be moved now from the Pas-de-Calais to Normandy, and the Allies really got scared. And so they decided to put everything into one major effort. And on the next day, the 8th, it had Garbo, probably a Spaniard incidentally, the most talented of that 3 superstar group. Garbo went to the German intelligence headquarters. He said, my 3 best men and I have been examining the situation carefully, going into the area and so on. We find that not a single soldier has been moved from southeastern Britain. We find that only 5 divisions have been sent to France. Well, we all know that they have the landing craft for 20 divisions. We regard it as inevitable, I'm paraphrasing of course, inevitable that in the next days there will be a great landing in the Pas-de-Calais. The thing works. On the next day, Hitler countermands the order, and his troops are kept in Normandy, and not only that, but the 116th Division, which was the best placed to cross the Seine and to join in Normandy, was actually moved down closer into the Pas-de-Calais area, making a reversal necessary and crossing much more difficult at a future date. Now, all I will do now is to summarize very briefly some of the great triumphs and some of the, not the failures of Ultra in particular, but the way in which the intelligence the Allies got was ignored or misused. And I'm not yet speaking of the Battle of the Bulge, which is, of course, by far the worst case, but which comes later. I'm dealing only with Normandy now. Now, the Allies scored 2 tremendous successes in the period after the landing. The first of these was the destruction of the headquarters of German Panzergruppe, or our Armored Group West. In other words, there was a major headquarters commanding all the armored forces in France. This was commanded by General Geyer von Schweppenborg. And we found out exactly where that headquarters was, and we smashed it to smithereens. I have talked to Geyer, who's dead now, but had a long talk with, 2 talks with him in 1969 and 70, and he was still trembling when he was just thinking of that situation. He himself was badly wounded. Many of his top officers were killed. The headquarters themselves were not flat. For 2 years, 2 weeks, the erection of the German armored forces in France was nil. And even after that, of course, it only gradually recovered and never was as good again as it would have been before. Then the other is the Battle of Mortain, which I've mentioned, where Hitler does something wonderful on paper, which was not only meaningless but disastrous, in fact, because he does so often else as in other cases, El Alamein, Stalingrad, and so on. He does not measure his resources against something he has very much at heart. And so Hitler, I'll make this very brief indeed, and I'd love to talk about it at great length. Remember, Patton's Third Army has landed on this side of the Allied position in Normandy, and it is now moving down here, a very narrow corridor. The front ran about like this. Here on the sea was a town called Avranches, and he's moving down into this area. And we have a really exciting story told by the SSO. I can't resist. Can I afford to? Sure. I think I can tell you this story. It's a fascinating one. Remember that Patton had bad experiences with his SLU, British ultraman in Sicily. Didn't like him and rejected him and the whole operation, which wasn't of much use there either. In France, he still retained these feelings so strongly that his very able G2, commander of intelligence, and Colonel Koch, felt just like the mayor of New York, Colonel Koch doesn't even mention the fact that an SSO has arrived, an American now, taking the place of the British SLU for his headquarters. And Koch pretty well ignores him too. He's polite to him. He comes in once in a while and looks at the latest messages. Then one day a really crusher comes in to this major. He is told from ultra sources that this is from Bletchley Park, of course. The message comes that Hitler has decided to try to drive down to the sea here, separate then the Third Army of Patton, moving down into here into Brittany, and that would create a tremendously dangerous situation for the Allied forces. And on paper, that state was brilliant. As a matter of fact, however, the resources just didn't even begin to manage for this kind of thing. And Hitler already had sent one division down and had been facing the British up farther here. One division has been sent to this area, and now he's going to send 4 more. Practically all the armor that had been facing the British. And this major is so excited that he runs to Colonel Koch's tent, and Koch is, who is suffering from stomach ulcer, is resting after lunch, wakes him up and says, "Here is information, I'm sure the general should have it." Koch agrees entirely. They go to see Patton, and Patton says, "You take this entirely seriously?" Koch says, "I certainly do." Patton is okay. It goes to the telephone and immediately orders that his last divisions, moving down now had been moving toward Brittany, will turn back and line up in that front that is being erected by Bradley against the German forces and become the Battle of Mortain. And then Patton does something which I admire very greatly. He's the only Allied general of whom I know who insisted that the man who got the messages from Bletchley Park report to him personally every day. Now, ordinarily, the messages that these men received were delivered by them to the G2, general or colonel who commanded then the intelligence, and this man would carry down to the commander-in-chief. If they were people who, like Monk Dixon of the First Army, were very vain and anxious to always shine, they wouldn't even tell the commander where it came from. He would just say, "We have now this information," or "I have this information." And the more sensation there was, the less he was likely to say, "There's this marvelous ultra thing which has given me and this person here has given it to me." So in other cases where the G2 is not quite that exclusive in his attitude toward dominating the intelligence picture, he takes the young man with him and sometimes lets him report rather than to report himself and then let the general ask this man some questions. Patton says, "From now on, I want you to report to me every single day." That was done, and in fact, this poor guy who had nothing to do with that, been twiddling his thumbs in his tent before, is so overrushed the next days that they had to get a second one. It's the only case I know of in World War II where they had to have a second SSO because the first one had just so much to do day and night that he just couldn't handle it anymore, and they had to get an extra one for that whole busy period down to about the middle of September. So I admire Patton for that. Incidentally, Patton also, so far as I know, is the only Allied general who demanded that in the information given him each day was not only what was pertinent to his own operations, but also to what was happening along the entire front. These poor SSOs had to stagger with maps of areas of which they had nothing to do. They were delighted. They were anything but unhappy about it. They first of all felt that they were doing something important. And then, of course, they appreciated more and more that it was important for the general to know what was going on in others than his own army sector. And as I say, Patton, so far as I know, is the only man who on the Allied side ever did that kind of thing. And I think he deserves tremendous credit for that. Those are the great victories of the Allies, this destruction of the headquarters of Armored Group West, and secondly the Battle of Mortain and what all that pertains to it. And then come two very bad phases. There's the battle which is known as Operation Goodwood. It was more or less agreed that Montgomery and his British 21st Army Group, which was the Canadian 2nd and the British 1st, or wait, British 2nd and Canadian 1st, that this was to try to fix the German armors, especially as much as they could on that area, so that the Cobra offensive was called, or Bradley could break through on the right-hand side. However, Montgomery was much more ambitious than that. He thought that it would be nice if he himself could break through. And he boasted as much that he was going to do so, even to the press. And he did this thing he always did, which was Montgomery was incredibly fussy about all the details, which is nice in many ways, that you know that you have looked at every angle and prepared yourself in every way for an offensive operation. But it also means that you make so many moves that it's almost impossible for the enemy to miss them all. This is traditional in history. We've had this again and again throughout history, that a general who is overcautious and over-fussy in making his preparations for offensive action gives away what he wants to do. And this was done entirely in the case of Goodwood, and also Montgomery ignored in largest part the information which was coming to him as for a German defensive buildup. Now, I deal with this in great detail. All these operations in Normandy are the major concentration of the latter part of my study on military, on the commander's uses of intelligence, and I wish I could go more into it. So Goodwood is not a disaster, at least a complete failure, except insofar as its purpose to fix the German forces for a time was successful. But the British lose half of all the armor they have in France. And they suffered tremendous casualties, and they do take the city of Caen finally, which was supposed to have been taken on the first day. In fact, Montgomery had boasted the day before the invasion began that in the first day he'd get through Caen and get to Falaise, which was 18 miles farther. He didn't get to Falaise, of course, until the famous Falaise pocket was established. And that brings me to the second great point, and this was a negative disaster in the sense that it sacrificed the big chance the Allies had to finish the war in France completely. As the Germans were forced by Hitler to keep on attacking, and then to stand where they were, way in the west, a few miles from the sea, way in this area over here. Right there. And as the commander-in-chief who has succeeded Rommel, who has been all but killed in that auto accident where he was strafed and his car turned over and he had a skull fracture, etc., etc. And that's one of the great disasters, of course, of the German conspiracy, that Rommel, who was in it, was incapacitated on the vital day of July 20th, when if he had been in full capacity of his faculties, he might have yet swung the situation in France in favor of real action against the regime. But here then is Rommel, or is Kluge, von Kluge, K-L-U-G-E, forced by Hitler, in spite of his pleas, to stay on and fight in this area, fight offensive as long as he possibly could, still trying to get down to Oran. And meantime, the Allied, first of all, and Allied forces here are pushing down, and Patton has begun his famous end run around the right here, and is getting to the south of the whole German position. So north and south of the German forces, there is this buildup of what became known as the Falaise pocket. Now, why wasn't the Falaise pocket closed? I go into that in considerable detail in the discussion that I've mentioned, and I don't want to do it now, and time is too short. If you want to bring it up in your questions, that's fine. But in any event, I think the responsibilities are divided. It's partly Monty. He was supposed to get to Falaise well before the Americans did. Actually, it was about Patton swinging around north. Some of his advance guards were moving into Falaise itself. The Canadians still were so many miles north. And the critique of Montgomery is that he should have put in the British Second Army of Dempsey, General Dempsey, and supported the Canadian action so he could close the thing from the north. Responsibility, I think, is at least equally Bradley's. Now, Bradley was the man who had the original idea of the Falaise pocket. That's the queer feature about this, that the person who, first of all, seems to have perceived on the Allied side that here was a great opportunity to completely surround the German forces from Normandy and destroy them utterly, then does not follow through. Why didn't he follow through? First, what did he actually do? Well, it had been agreed that, as I said, that the British would reach, but via the Canadians, would reach Falaise in the north, and then Patton would move north from Argenton, which he had reached. Remember, Patton had gone north already with his advance guards, or first scouting forces, moving into Falaise. There's now a famous telephone conversation between Bradley and Patton, in which Bradley orders Patton absolutely to withdraw those forces and not to be moving north any further. Now, just why? We find that both Bradley and those who take his side have all kinds of excuses, which to me seem specious. Bradley on one occasion says, he says it in his book, that the information he had seemed to imply that most of the Germans already were out of the pocket, but there wasn't much sense in closing it. Then almost in the same breath, he has said that there was a real danger of a breakthrough. If you had a rather thin line closing the pocket in the east, then the German forces might well break through and cause a considerable disaster. Another thing that he says is that there was danger of a collision between the Canadian troops and the American troops. Now, this is an old historic fact, that again and again in history, either Allied forces or forces of the same country coming in from different directions at the same point got mixed up, shoot at each other as if they were the enemy, and that there is a considerable loss in that case. This, of course, was true. But after all, the British and Canadians, or the Canadians and the Americans, eventually had to meet. And why would it be less dangerous a couple of days later than it was at the start? My friend Martin Blumenson has written about this and so many other things, with whom I differ so often in the most affectionate way. He supports the idea that the Allies would have been risking things if they had closed that pocket. Well, I ask you who have any knowledge of military history, if all those who in history have been able to succeed in a double envelopment, if they had been worried about the fact that the enemy at some point might break through that line, which perforce would have thin at points, if they had done that, there never would have been any envelopments, never would have been any of the great captures of history of entirely enemy forces, like the famous battle between the Romans and Hannibal, Cannae of 206 BC. It's the classic battle of double envelopment. So we fail in this, and it's one of the really most unhappy situations possible, especially because, as Bradley does not tell us, in fact implies the opposite, the ultra information these days was about the richest of the war. The man who first of all studied ultra and its effects the most, this is the British historian Ronald Lewin, whose book Ultra Goes to War was the first skimming off, you might say, of the riches of information on Allied intelligence as it became available, but who, like all freelancers, had to think in the first place of selling books. So instead of waiting until he had as much as possible in the way of documentary information, my friend Ronald published a little early and only had kind of a skimming off of this rich cream which was gathering, and which even 6 months later would have been far more valuable. And then he also has written a book which I think is by far was the only one really on the general subject, the Ultra-Americans it's called. It deals with the American Magic. Ultra-American is another book by a man named Tom Parrish. The American Magic. Magic, as you I think all know, is the cover name for the American operation in the Pacific, which was the opposite number to Ultra in Europe. And it's, I think, generally speaking, though again, being written when the information was just beginning to crowd out into the archives from the various intelligence agency. It's very good under those circumstances, but naturally suffers from the disadvantage that it is not yet anything like what even half a year later we were supposed to have available. And Lewin said if there was anything lacking during the Falaise operation, that was not information about the enemy. In other words, they had a mass of information as to the condition of the German forces. One of the queer features is that Bradley at times talks as if there was a real danger that the Germans might cause a great Allied defeat by breaking through. Also is the most eloquent of all in describing the incredible pell-mell and confusion of the German forces as they crowded westwards with complete Allied air control and with the guns firing in north and south of them as well as in their rears. That's as far as I've gone in this consideration. There's, of course, what I've said in the last few minutes is just a small consideration of the operations in the later part of the Normandy operations and our campaign. And if you're really interested, read the account that I mentioned before, which will be available in July. That's it.
While Dr. Deutsch rests a moment, let me just make a couple of comments. Frank Frisson, who just left, wanted me to announce, and I should have done this before we started with Hal this evening. You recall the air show is in Oshkosh every year, and as a part of that, then they come into the downtown St. Paul airport in August, and I think that's about the second weekend. Keep that in mind. But they're going to have, as a part of that, Ron, what's his name? Jablowski? Help me, the wrote about the 8th Air Force, Jablowski? Help me with the name.
The present 8th Air Force?
No, the historian on the B-17, Jablowski, or?
Wait a minute, no.
Jablonski, I think it is.
American Ace?
No, Jablonski. He's written several books on the Jablonski.
Yeah.
He's going to be here for 3 days. The 8th Air Force Association is going to sponsor him, and they're going to have some seminars with that. So Frank is going to give me information on that as it becomes available. It's one of those waiting for schedules. So if you are interested and you don't see it in the paper, give me a call, and hopefully I'll have that through Frank. Yes.
There's a Lieutenant General going to speak tomorrow at the Officers Club at supper time. Lieutenant General Eddie Heinz from Hastings. He's going to talk on, thought I'd bring it up. He's Air Force Intelligence and Lieutenant General. He's going to talk on CIA liaison. That's at the Officers Club tomorrow, 7th.
Any other, and then one other thing, I've got this old-timers disease. Our next meeting, no, old-timers. October 13th will be our next planned meeting for the roundtable. And Ron also, Frank mentioned that the 8th Air Force National Reunion will be occurring right after that. And we will be planning to have a presentation by the 8th Air Force as part of our agenda next year. So,
Is that Thursday again?
yeah, we'll plan to do it the second Thursday. That seems to have worked out pretty well for most schedules, so I appreciate you putting that down. Yes?
Is there a bibliography available, or do you want it available sometime in the future?
I'm sure we can make it available.
Well, on bibliography, the American Committee on the History of the Second World War has a set of fantastic bibliographies. You know, to what degree we get hold, well, I have copies of them all, but this involves quite a stack. They have, as books come out, they sometimes have several hundred books, and it would be quite a thing from the standpoint of actually duplicating this and putting it together. I don't know what it can be done, but I suggest that you suggest to Don what you think we could do about that, how to make it available. I don't think we have the facilities nor the funds to duplicate it all and make it available to everybody. On the other hand, those who are really interested, really want to plunge in to a study of World War II in some depth, maybe there are suggestions that could be implemented.
Well, one thing that I hope to do is to preserve the library. I've been through audio and other people through videotaping the presentations this year. We'll try to preserve that in one place, and I think most of the people here have pretty extensive libraries, of course, of things, or video libraries. There's so many resources for capturing information these days. But maybe what we can do in the future as a part of our program is to have people, I know that Harold's done it in the past, of bringing forward new books that are of interest to people. Maybe we shouldn't rush the program so much and do something like that. And maybe bring things like our meetings, so it is a resource. Again, this is, I keep talking about membership, this is kind of a loose confederation, if you will, but...
That brings to mind a book I was reading not the whole book, today. It is called Stalag Luft, no, wait a minute. The Secret of Stalag Luft 3. Now, Stalag Luft 3 was the German prison camp, which had particular American airmen in it, and because it was run by the German Air Force. And this book will come out, University of Louisiana State Press is publishing it. It should come out within the next 6 weeks or so. And it's an infinitely better job than that book called The Great, or that movie called The Great Escape. How many have seen The Great Escape? And I haven't seen it myself, but I'm told that it's a very dramatic movie, and it's a combination, of course, of fact and fiction, as most movies are. And this man is a member of the present Air Force, but he also has a PhD both in history, I'm not sure it's military history, and political theory, and writes a very competent book. As far as I've read it up to now, and I've just been this afternoon looking into it for perhaps an hour, it looks to me like a competent job. If any of you by any chance was a prisoner in Stalag Luft, I'm sure that you will jump at the information about it.
Well, if anyone has any questions, please address them.
Yes, please.
Professor Deutsch, if, I think you made reference to the fact that the 3 German armored units and 5 divisions were about to be released to the south, and through a deception they were delayed.
The west.
The west, right. What have you heard about people who, knowledgeable people, have said would have happened to Normandy if they had gone into Normandy?
Well, the thing I've jumped over was I was going to summarize what the Germans could have done. Now, the Germans could have had in Normandy 31 divisions and all the armor in France within a matter of 25 days if they had decided to go whole hog. That would have been way beyond anything that Eisenhower would have matched, either from the standpoint of manpower or that he could have supplied if the manpower had been available. And the invasion almost certainly would have failed. When you consider that under these circumstances, the Germans still were able to hold Montgomery for a period of about 6 weeks at the place where he had been the first day of the invasion, not the second or third day, the first day of the invasion. And that the Americans had made very minor advance, really, to that very difficult country. And that's something also I skipped over. I skipped over all kinds of things. The American and English, British terrain intelligence was lousy. Nobody had even thought of the bocage except one man who should have done something about it. That was the British Chief of Staff, Alan Brooke, who happened to make that area, that hedgerow country of Normandy, a special vacation area for himself. He knew it thoroughly. And he said, in fact, at one time before the invasion to one of his associates, the Americans will never get through that bocage country. And yet he did not alert the Allied leadership to a set of policies which would try as much as possible to meet that problem. As we had an incredibly difficult time in that bocage country. This, of course, while the main bocage country was in front of the Americans, not of the British. But even Montgomery's area was difficult in many respects. If you read the book of Stephen Ambrose, he just was so kind as to send me a copy. I've read it. I have another one somewhere, but maybe I have only the manuscript. Pegasus Bridge. Well, that's really the first part. That's the background of the Goodwood operation. If you look at the Goodwood operation, you get some notion of the physical impediments that even the British faced, little as they were compared to what we faced. There's not a reference to it even in the pre-invasion intelligence. Something that should have preoccupied me. Yes, sir, you had a question.
You mentioned the German penetration of the Dutch resistance.
Yes.
Did that have a large effect on the failure of the Arnhem operation later on?
Of which operation?
Arnhem, Market Garden?
No, I don't think so. Because that particular group that gave us the information there, in the first place, had not been penetrated. They didn't penetrate every aspect of the Dutch resistance. Remember, we got the information before Market Garden, the crossing of the Rhine at Arnhem, that the situation here was one where the German, two of the armored divisions that had been beaten in Normandy were refitting in the area. And the headquarters of the man who commanded all the German troops in the last phase of Normandy, General Model, Field Marshal Model, was only, I think, something like 7-8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge. And, well, again, I go into that quite thoroughly in the discussion which I mentioned. And I think is one of the most fantastic errors of the war, though it only compounds what had happened when Montgomery failed to take the estuary of Scheldt as he should have done at the same time that he grabbed the city of Antwerp. And that was an incredible mistake that perhaps was the worst mistake of World War II almost. If you look at military leadership, it's the failure of the Allies, essentially the failure of Monty, but Eisenhower only woke up gradually, much too late, to realize that if they were going to have big operations in this region, they had to have a really active port. The greatest port in Northern Europe was Antwerp. And Antwerp, of course, was not a port on the sea. It was at the end of a big estuary. And the area north of this estuary, especially the island of Grand Charon, was one through which the Germans were moving and retreating from the west. And the German general von Zangen, Z-A-N-G-E-N, who was very able in this situation, was able to seize at Hitler's command. Hitler, again, his real talents occasionally amaze you. Hitler perceived this, the Allied leaders didn't, but he perceived this importance of getting hold of both sides of the estuary, and there he sat in Antwerp and couldn't get a single ship into it. And that went on for weeks. As I recall, it's 6 weeks that were lost as a result of this. Maybe some of you can correct me and be more exact. Maybe it was only 5 weeks, maybe it was 7. In any event, the situation at Arnhem was unbelievably bad. All kinds of sexual aspects, especially, of course, too, that they dropped that the British Airbound Division at the wrong spot, much too far away. And the British Airborne Division was the finest division in the British Army. It lost 3/4 of all its personnel, had to be disbanded after Arnhem. Did I have answered your question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier in the talk how early in the war the British had captured the German spies. How were they able to do this?
Well, first of all, the spies were all revealed to them either by the correspondence, the messages, going back and forth between Berlin and Hamburg in particular, sometimes also Lisbon or Madrid. And then when you caught a group, you usually got, most spies were not working by themselves, but were a little group, a team, which according to the old, as I said, the old good and very good custom of all espionage services, what was not to have all people in one organization, that if you captured somebody and tortured him, for example, or bribed him, you could learn about the whole operation. So you had a team of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, and there was another team of which this group had never heard a word, maybe the same number, operating perhaps on the same problem in some cases, or a little different area. And so they were able, by a process of elimination, to get at every single one of the German agents. Of course, another thing that they were able to use was, of course, the intelligence associated with the location of the wireless that the individuals had. You could find the actual house in which they were operating in some cases. Yes, sir. I think there's another hand. Have I answered your question there, sir? Yes.
You mentioned the disruption of the German communications right before the invasion.
Yes.
Was this one of the operations of these Jedburgh teams that went in? Did they make any contribution to that at all?
Here's a reference to the Jedburgh team. The Jedburgh teams, in fact, I had something to do with them. I had nothing to do with cloak and dagger stuff. In other words, secret intelligence. I was in charge only of political research in this country and research in general in Europe for OSS. And the Jedburghs were people who were very vigorous young fellows, usually 6-footers and everything else like it, who were recruited. I remember going out for OSS and going to the University of Illinois and the University of Wisconsin. University of Minnesota. The head of, I forget the name of the man, the Yugoslav name. It was one of the men I think I recruited personally here. Later on, was the captain of our football team in 1949 or 50. And these Jedburghs, as they were called, Jedburgh was then just a silly name that was going to completely fool anybody. No hint at all what this referred to. These Jedburghs then were people whom we dropped from the air in Yugoslavia, like this man. I think of his name in a second.
John Blotnick was involved in...
I think there's some connection with that too, yes. And these Jedburghs were certainly associated with resistance forces everywhere. That was their job. It was to either do direct sabotage in some cases without the resistance, but more often to get into contact with them and to cooperate in order to, in one way or another, impede the German defensive effort. Does that cover the point?
Yes.
Or do you have another one?
The thing that impressed me about that whole operation is that they had very few, if any, casualties in the...
Among the Jedburghs?
Yes.
Well, probably they were pretty well trained.
Yes, they
Very
were.
often our OSS people were not too well trained. But Jedburghs apparently were, because I think I can also substantiate what you had to say there, that we didn't hear very much of any wholesale destruction of the Jedburgh system, as we often did in many of the other operations which we were undertaking behind the lines.
That fellow's name Wolsonoski?
No, that's not it. No. I remember in particular, because he was one of my favorite students, and how completely devastated he was. Bernie Bierman, as you all know, was quite a disciplinarian. And this was the captain and center of the football team. And incidentally, Bernie didn't seem to like him too much because Bernie had wanted somebody else to be elected captain. This has happened several times.
Is his first name Urban?
Pardon me?
First name Urban?
I don't think so. It's a Yugoslav name, at least. It's not also not, I'm quite sure not. But anyhow, this was the captain of the team, and he was taken out at a certain point. And the game arrived at a very critical point, and he got so excited he rushed under the field and took his position without having authority. Well, and then as he told me the story himself, Bierman disciplined him. On Monday morning, the teams were lined up, first team, second team, third team, one man in the fourth team, he. Captain of the whole football team. Yes.
Yes, I'm the Arms of Crook by Manchester.
Yes.
This is moving a little bit further in the history, but you obviously know every detail of the war.
No, I don't, but I hope I didn't well, so lousy.
Much more than I ever will. I want you to tell me if this is true and respond to it. A phrase struck me in there. He's talking about the bankrolling of Hitler's rise to power. And he mentioned that at a critical juncture, Hitler received 3 million Deutschmarks, 1 million from the Krupp family, 1 million from other German industrialists, and the third million from American industrialists. And that, it just stuck in my mind for 10 years or so. Could you tell me anything about that?
That's been stated again and again, but it's highly controversial so far as the American support is concerned. I think it is not established, though it's not inconceivable. And of course, Hitler got support from various sources, but less from the Krupps by far than from Thyssen, for example. Thyssen, T-H-Y-S-S-E-N, was the head of United Steel Works in Germany, the biggest steel combine. And he was a very active supporter of the Nazis in the critical period, though later on he fell out with Hitler, and during the war actually left the country for Switzerland. Now, the book on Manchester, incidentally, is the first major book he wrote. I reviewed it with very great care. I think it was not dishonest, but Manchester himself, in my opinion, is dishonest. He, in connection with other books, has stolen.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.